In this video, we're going to keep looking for the characteristics or attributes of the functions for the second part, which is increasing, decreasing intervals, and f of 3. Okay? So now let's look at the do now from last time. Okay? So what is the range of this graph? So we know when we do range, we're looking for the boundaries on the top and the bottom of this graph. So we're going to draw the boundary lines on the top and bottom of the graph. So this is the top of my graph, and I draw a boundary line on the top, and the boundary number falls on 5. So the top boundary is 5. And then look for the bottom of your graph. So this is the lowest part of my graph, and my graph stops here. So that's it. The graph is no longer going anywhere. So this is the bottom of the graph. So draw a bottom boundary like this on the bottom, and the boundary falls on -4. So on the bottom, the boundary is -4. So your answer for the range is from -4 to 5. And that's it. So this is from our last homework. A lot of us got this question wrong, so we finished reviewing it. Okay. So now let's look at today's content. We first, again, how are you going to look at a graph? We always look at a graph from left to the right, because let's look at this part of the graph. Okay? For this part of the graph, if you go from left to the right, you'll see this part of the graph from left to the right, it is going down. However, if you look at it from right to the left, if you look at it this way, then the graph is going up. So we have to have a unit way of looking at the graph, which is always from left to the right, not from right to the left, to decide whether this part of the graph is going up or going down. Okay, so now let's look at the concept. First, increasing interval. Okay, increasing interval is the boundary on the left and the right side. So we know we're going to draw this kind of boundary from left to the right boundary of the growing part of the graph. Okay, so we have a graph, and which part of the graph is going up? This part of the graph is going up. And you're going to draw a boundary on this part of the graph, and you're going to give me the boundary numbers as your increasing interval as the answer. So let's look at an example. So in this example, where is the increasing interval? So to look at the increasing interval, we know we're going to look for the growing up part of the graph first. Okay, so from left to the right, this part is going down, this part of the graph is growing up. Okay, so this part of the graph is growing up. Now we're going to draw a boundary line for this part of the growing up graph. So from here, on the left, this is a boundary line. On the right, this is a boundary line. Okay, so from here, this boundary to here, the right boundary is where my graph growing up. Okay, so now you're going to look for the boundary numbers, which is -3, and here the boundary number is 9. Okay, so the increasing interval is from -3 to 9, which is where your graph is growing up. Okay, so the answer is from -3 to 9. And that's it. Okay, so let's see one more time, how did we find it? First, question asked about the increasing interval. So which part of the graph is growing up? This part of the graph is growing up. So you'll find this part of the graph, and on this part, draw a boundary bar on this part of the graph, and where the bar hit the number line is what your answer falls, -3 and 9, and put it in the answer part. Okay, so that's it about increasing interval. Now let's look at the next concept, decreasing interval. Okay. Again, it is a boundary on the left and right, so we still draw this kind of boundary bars. On the, okay, there is a mistake. On the, sorry, it's not a mistake. On the growing down part of the graph, okay? So decreasing means going down, okay? So we look for the growing down part of the graph and draw a boundary bar and see where the bars hit the number line, okay? So let's get an example. Okay. Decreasing interval, which part of the graph is growing down? Okay, so from left to the right, this part of the graph is growing down. Some of you are confused with the arrow. Okay, the arrow tells you the graph keeps going without ending. It doesn't tell you it's going up. Okay, so this part of the graph is growing down. So this is a decreasing part of your graph. Now draw a boundary line on the decreasing part. So this is the right side of the boundary line, which stops at -3 here. Okay? And for the left side, where is your boundary bar? You see the arrow on the graph, so you know your graph keeps going to the left with no limitation. So on the left side, your boundary bar falls way over there without limitation, and we know to represent without limitation, we're doing the infinity. Is it positive infinity or negative infinity? Let's look at the number line. So your boundary bar is hitting the number line here and here. So what are the numbers on the number line here? It's -3, -6, -9 until negative infinity. So the intervals or the boundaries of the decreasing part of the graph is from negative infinity to -3. Okay. So starting from negative infinity, your graph starts growing down and it stops growing down at -3 in this area, in this interval. Okay. Next concept. F parenthesis 2 equals what? Okay, so first you have to know what this question is asking about. Okay, so the number inside of the parenthesis means when x equals 2, and the question is what is the corresponding y value? Okay, whatever the number is inside of the parenthesis, it means when x, always x. When x equals that number, what is the corresponding y value on the graph? So let's look at some examples. So first one, f3, f of 3. So it means when x equals 3, y equals what? Okay, so first, this is the information we know, so let's look for this information on the graph. X equals 3, so on the x-axis, okay, look for the number 3. It is here. So x equals 3 is here on the x-axis. So when x is 3, what is the corresponding y value? So how are you going to look for the y value? Okay, so we're going to do this. Starting from x equals 3, extending your mark to touch your graph. Okay, so we're talking about this point on the graph. So what is the y value of this point? So starting from this point on the graph, go to touch y-axis. It touches at 2. So your answer is 2. So when x equals 3, the corresponding y value on the graph is 2. So 3 is corresponding to 2 on the y-axis on that point on the graph. Okay. Now let's look at another example. F of -3. So when x is -3, y equals what? So first look for -3 on the x-axis. On the x-axis, -3 is here. Now we're going to look for the corresponding point on the graph. So extending your mark to touch the graph. Okay? It touches here, so we're talking about this point on the graph. So what is the corresponding y value of this point? So starting from this point, go to touch y-axis. It touches here, so your answer is -4. Okay? So when x is -3 on the x-axis, y is -4 on the y-axis, and the corresponding point on the graph is here. Okay. Next example. When x, this is read as f of 1. Okay? So when x equals 1, y equals what? So x, so we look for 1 on the x-axis, which is here. And now extending your mark to touch the graph. And we already see the mark is already on the graph. So actually we're talking about this point on the graph. So now you're going to tell me the corresponding y value of this point. So starting from this point, go to touch y-axis. Say touch here at the origin, and we know for the origin the value is 0. So your answer is 0. Okay? So when x equals 1 here on the x-axis, we're talking about this point on the graph, and the y value of this graph is 0. Okay. Next one. F of -7. When x equals -7, y equals what? So look for -7 on the x-axis. -7 is here on the x-axis, and we're going to extend our mark to touch the graph. You see the mark is already touching the graph. So we're talking about this point on the graph. And now we're looking for the y value of this point. So starting from this point, go to touch y-axis, and they touch here again at the origin. So we know origin is 0. Okay? So when x equals -7, the corresponding y value of the point on the graph is 0. Okay. So that's all about the concepts. Now let's do some examples together. More examples. Increasing interval of this graph. So first, look for the increasing part of the graph from left to the right. This part of the graph is growing up. Okay. Now draw a boundary bar on this growing part. So here on the right side, this is a boundary bar, and it touches to on the number line. And on the left side, you see the arrow, so you know your picture keeps going to the left. So on the left side, your boundary falls way over there to no limitation, which is infinity. Is it positive or negative infinity? Let's look at the number line. So the bar is touching this number line here, and the numbers on the number line are -1, -2, -4, negative infinity. Okay. So the increasing part of the graph is here, and the boundary bars are from negative infinity to positive 2. Okay. Just remember, when you see the arrow, it means infinity. And you're going to decide whether it is positive or negative infinity based on which part of the number line it is hitting. Okay. Next one. Decreasing interval of this graph. So from left to the right, this part of the graph is growing down. Okay. And you're gonna draw, we're looking for the decreasing part of the graph, and now you're gonna draw the boundary bars on the left and right. So on the left side, your graph starts growing down from here. So this is a left side bar, and it hit the number line at 2. So the boundary number is 2. Okay. On the right side, you see the graph on the right side have an arrow. So we know the boundary on the right side is way over there to infinity. Is it positive infinity or negative infinity? Your boundary bar is hitting the number line here, and the numbers on the number line are positive 5, positive 7, positive 8, positive infinity. Okay? So the boundary for the decreasing part of the graph is from 2 to positive infinity. Whether you put the plus sign or don't have the plus sign, both of it means positive infinity. Okay. Next one. This is also the question about increasing or decreasing interval, but it asks you in another way. So let's read it. Is the graph increasing or decreasing from x equals -1 to x equals 2 in this interval? Is the graph increasing or decreasing? Okay. So let's look at the information here. X equals -1. Let's look at -1 on x-axis. Okay. -1 is here. And 2x equals 2. So let's look at 2 on x-axis. 2 is here. So in this area, so let's draw the boundary bars based on these two boundary numbers. Okay. So between these two boundaries is that part of the graph is growing up or down. So between these boundaries, this is the part of the graph inside of this boundary. So is this part of the graph going up or down from left to the right? We can see it is going down. So this part of the graph is decreasing in these two boundaries. So our answer is decreasing. Okay, next one. Is the graph increasing or decreasing from in the inside of this interval? Okay, so let's look at these two numbers on the x-axis. X equals 4. So on x-axis, 4 is here. X equals 6. This is 5 and here is 6. Okay. So these are the boundary numbers. Okay, so let's draw the boundary line based on these two boundary numbers. Okay. So we're gonna decide inside of this boundary is the part of the graph growing up or growing down. So inside of this part of the boundary, we have this part of the graph there, okay? And from left to the right. From left to the right, is this part of the graph growing up or down? Is from left to the right. You can draw the graph and your pencil is growing up. So this part of the graph is growing up. So growing up means increasing. So inside of this boundaries, your part of the graph is increasing. Okay, next one. F of 1. So remember this question tells you when x equals 1, y equals what on the graph? Okay, so let's look for 1 on x-axis. It is here. When x equals 1, what is the corresponding y value? So from 1, go to touch the graph. It touches here, so we're talking about this point. So what is the y value of this point? Starting from this point, go to touch y-axis, it touches 3. So the answer is 3. When x equals 1, the corresponding y value is 3. Okay. Next one. F of 4. So when x equals 4, so it is here on the x-axis, 4 is here. Okay? And from this number, go to touch your graph. We see this mark is already touching the graph. So we're talking about this point on the graph. So what is the y value, corresponding y value of this point? From this point, go to touch y-axis. It touches at the origin. So the value is here at the origin, which is 0. So when x equals 4, the corresponding y value equals 0 for that specific point. Okay. Next one, f of 0. Okay. When x equals 0, so on the x-axis, 0 is here, mark it. Okay. So when x is 0 here, what is the corresponding y value? So from this mark, go to touch your graph. Graph is here. Okay. So we go up to touch the graph. We touched it, it is here. So we're talking about this point on the graph. So what is the y value of this point? This point is already on the y-axis. So just tell me what is the y value of this point, where it falls on the y-axis. It is between 4 and 5. So it's 4.5. Okay. Next one. Increasing interval. Okay. So we're looking for the growing up part of the graph and then draw the two boundary bars. So from left to the right, this part of the graph is growing down, so we're not looking at it. This part of the graph is growing up. Okay, so and let's keep looking, let's finish looking at it. This part of the graph is growing down. We're looking for growing up. Okay, so we're not looking at this. This part of the graph is flat. We're not looking at it. This part of the graph is growing down. We're not looking at it. So we only have one increasing part on the graph, which is this one. Now, on this part, draw the boundary line from the beginning of this part to the end of this increasing part. So draw the two boundary bars. It is here. And see where the boundary bars hit the number line. On the left, it hit at -4. On the right, it hit at -2. So the increasing interval is from -4 to -2. In these boundaries from -4 to -2 is where my graph increasing. Okay. Next one. Is the graph increasing or decreasing in the interval -2 to +2, and we know the interval is always from left to the right. And to cut left to the right, it is only on the x-axis. Okay, so on the x-axis, look at -2. It is here. So this is the left side boundary, and then x equals 2 is here. So this is the right side boundary. So between these two boundary bars is that part of the graph growing up or growing down. So between these two boundary bars, we cut this part of the graph. So is it growing up or down? You see your pencil is going down, right? So it's growing down. So it's decreasing. Okay. Next one. F of 3. When x equals 3, y equals what? So on the x-axis, number 3 is here, mark it. From your mark, go to touch the graph. It touches here, so we're talking about this point on the graph. So what is the y value of this graph? From this point, go to touch y-axis. It touches at 1. So your answer is y equals 1. Okay. Next, your exit ticket. Okay, so that's it about increasing interval, decreasing interval, and f of 3 equals what?